The morning sun was just beginning to peek through the large windows of Pete's diner, casting long shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Harold Matthews, a 93-year-old veteran with silver hair and kind blue eyes, pushed open the heavy glass door with his weathered hands. The familiar bell chimed above, announcing his arrival just as it had every morning for the past 15 years. "Good morning, Mr. Matthews." Sarah, the young waitress with copper-colored hair, called out cheerfully. She was already reaching for his favorite coffee mug, the blue one with a small chip on the handle that he claimed made it perfect for his arthritic grip. Harold nodded politely, making his way to his usual booth in the corner. His movements were slow but deliberate, each step carefully planned. The wooden cane he used made a soft tapping sound against the floor, keeping time with his measured pace. He wore his Korean War veteran cap proudly, its pins and medals gleaming under the diner's fluorescent lights. "The usual breakfast, sir?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Harold had ordered the same meal every morning since before she started working there. 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast with a pat of butter, and a side of crispy bacon. "Yes, please, Sarah," Harold replied with a gentle smile. His voice was soft but clear, carrying the weight of years of stories behind it. He adjusted his reading glasses and pulled out the morning newspaper from his worn leather bag, spreading it carefully on the table before him. The diner was quiet at this early hour. A few regulars sat at the counter, nursing their coffees and exchanging quiet conversations about weather and local politics. The cook, Pete Jr., whose father had opened the diner 40 years ago, worked steadily behind the grill, the sizzle of bacon creating a comforting background noise. Harold's hands trembled slightly as he lifted his coffee cup, but years of practice meant not a drop was spilled. He had developed his own system for everything, from the way he arranged his silverware to how he folded his napkin in his lap. The other regulars respected his routine, understanding that it was these small rituals that gave structure to his days since losing his wife, Martha, 5 years ago. As he read his paper, Harold occasionally glanced at the old photographs hanging on the diner's walls. There was one, slightly faded and yellowed with age, that showed Pete's Diner on its opening day in 1983. Harold had been there, standing proud and tall beside his wife. Back then, his hair had still been pepper gray instead of silver, and his back had been straight as a ramrod. Sarah returned with his breakfast, setting it down exactly how he liked it. Eggs on the left, toast on the right, bacon arranged neatly in the middle. "There you go, Mr. Matthews. I made sure Pete Jr. made the bacon extra crispy, just how you like it." "Thank you, dear," Harold replied, carefully folding his newspaper and setting it aside. "You remind me so much of my Martha, always remembering the little things." The morning light grew stronger, filling the diner with a warm glow. Harold ate his breakfast slowly, methodically, savoring each bite. He watched as more customers began to filter in, the early morning office workers grabbing coffee to go, young mothers with small children in tow, and retired couples like he and Martha used to be. From his corner booth, Harold observed it all with quiet interest. He noticed how Mrs. Johnson from the flower shop always ordered her coffee with 3 sugars, how the young man in the business suit was clearly working up the courage to ask Sarah for her number, and how the new family that had moved in down the street was slowly becoming part of the diner's regular crowd. This was his world now, this corner of Pete's Diner, where the coffee was always hot, the bacon was always crispy, and people still took the time to say good morning. It wasn't the same as the busy life he'd led during his military days, or the years he'd spent working at the local hardware store after the war, but it was his piece of peace in a world that sometimes seemed to move too fast. As the morning wore on, Harold finished his breakfast and prepared to leave for his daily walk to the park. He left his usual generous tip for Sarah, gathered his newspaper and cane, and stood carefully. Little did he know that this familiar routine was about to be disrupted in ways he couldn't imagine. The peaceful routine at Pete's Diner changed dramatically one sunny Tuesday morning when the rumbling sound of motorcycle engines shook the windows. 6 large motorcycles pulled into the parking lot, their chrome pipes gleaming in the morning sun. The riders, wearing black leather jackets covered in patches and chains, walked into the diner with heavy boots thumping against the floor. Harold looked up from his newspaper, his weathered hands tightening slightly around his coffee cup. The leader of the group, a tall man with a thick beard and tattoos covering his arms, wore a vest with snake stitched across the back. The bikers took over the largest booth, just 2 tables away from Harold's usual spot. Sarah approached their table nervously, her usual cheerful smile slightly strained. "Welcome to Pete's Diner. What can I get for you, gentlemen?" Snake looked around the diner, his eyes lingering on Harold's Korean War veteran cap. "Coffee, black, for everyone," he said loudly. "And make it quick, sweetheart." His tone made Sarah's smile fade completely. As she hurried away, one of the younger bikers noticed Harold watching them. "Hey, old-timer," he called out with a smirk. "Take a picture, it'll last longer." The other bikers laughed, their voices echoing through the usually quiet diner. Harold calmly returned to his newspaper, but his hands trembled more than usual as he turned the page. He had faced worse in Korea, he reminded himself, though the memories of those days seemed very far away now. The bikers' presence changed the entire atmosphere of the diner. Regular customers began eating faster, speaking in whispers and leaving quickly. Pete Jr. kept glancing worriedly from behind the grill, especially when the bikers started making loud jokes about the retirement home crowd. When Sarah brought their coffee, Snake deliberately stuck out his boot, causing her to stumble. Coffee splashed across the floor, and while she apologized and rushed to clean it up, the bikers just laughed harder. "Careful there, princess," Snake said with a mock concern that made his friend snicker. "Wouldn't want any of our elderly friends to slip and break a hip." Harold watched this scene unfold, his jaw tightening. He remembered how Martha would have handled such behavior, with a mix of grace and quiet strength. But Martha wasn't here anymore, and the diner that had been his sanctuary was becoming a place of tension. The next morning, the bikers were back, arriving just as Harold was settling into his usual routine. This time, they were even louder, playing music from their phones and making comments about the ancient relics taking up space in the diner. "Hey, look at this," one of them said, pointing at Harold's veteran cap. "Think he actually fought in anything, or just bought that hat at a yard sale?" Snake got up and walked over to Harold's table, his heavy boots echoing with each step. He leaned down, placing both hands on the table and looking directly at Harold. "Nice hat, Grandpa, but wearing a costume doesn't make you a real soldier." The diner fell silent. Even the sizzling of bacon on the grill seemed to quiet down. Harold met Snake's gaze steadily, his blue eyes clear and unwavering. He said nothing, but his hand instinctively touched the medals pinned to his cap. "Leave him alone," Sarah said suddenly, her voice shaking but determined. "Mr. Matthews is a regular here, and he deserves respect." Snake straightened up slowly, turning to face Sarah with a dangerous smile. "Respect. Respect is earned, sweetheart. And from what I can see, all this old-timer has earned is a discount on his coffee." The other bikers laughed. Their laughter died quickly when Harold slowly stood up, leaning on his cane. For a moment, despite his age, something in his posture made him seem taller, stronger. But before he could speak, Snake had already turned away, dismissing him with a wave of his hand. As Harold sat back down, he noticed his hands were steady now, steadier than they had been in years. The fear and uncertainty had been replaced by something else, a familiar feeling he hadn't experienced since his days in Korea. He knew that sooner or later he would have to stand up to these bullies, not just for himself, but for Sarah, Pete Jr., and all the other regular customers who made this diner special. Little did the bikers know, Harold Matthews was not a man who backed down easily, and he had survived far worse situations than this. The tension at Pete's Diner grew worse over the next 2 weeks. The bikers now came every morning, seeming to take special pleasure in disrupting Harold's peaceful routine. They would rev their engines extra loud when arriving, making the old veteran's coffee cup rattle on its saucer. Some regular customers had stopped coming altogether, afraid of the increasingly hostile atmosphere. On this particular morning, Harold sat at his usual booth, trying to focus on his newspaper, but his eyes kept drifting to the framed photographs on the wall, especially the one of him and Martha from years ago. He wondered what she would say about the situation now. Snake and his gang burst through the door, louder than ever. This time, they had a new member with them, a younger man with a shaved head who seemed eager to prove himself to the group. As they settled into their booth, the new guy kept staring at Harold, nudging his friends and whispering something that made them laugh. "Hey, war hero," the newcomer called out suddenly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What's the matter? Forgot how to talk?" He got up and walked over to Harold's table, picking up Harold's coffee cup without permission and examining it. Maybe he's too old to remember how to speak. Sarah, who was watching from behind the counter, stepped forward. That's enough. Put Mr. Matthews' cup down right now. The young biker smirked and deliberately held the cup over the floor. Or what? He asked, letting the cup slip through his fingers. It shattered on the linoleum with a crash that seemed to echo through the silent diner. Harold didn't flinch. He looked at the broken pieces of his favorite cup, the one Martha had given him years ago, scattered across the floor. His face remained calm, but something changed in his eyes. They took on a steely glint that hadn't been seen since his days in Korea. Snake watched from his booth, grinning. Looks like Grandpa needs a sippy cup, he called out, encouraging his new member's behavior. Pete Jr. emerged from the kitchen, his face red with anger. That's it. I'm calling the police. No need, Harold said quietly, speaking for the first time that morning. His voice was steady and clear, carrying across the diner with unexpected authority. I can handle this. He reached slowly into his worn leather bag and pulled out an old leather wallet. The bikers watched, curious despite themselves, as his wrinkled hands carefully opened it. Inside was a photograph, yellowed with age but still clear enough to see. Before you continue with your little show of power, Harold said, his voice growing stronger, you might want to take a look at this. He placed the photograph on the table, but didn't slide it toward them yet. The young biker who had broken the cup snorted. What's that supposed to be? Your baby pictures? Come and see for yourself, Harold replied calmly, unless you're afraid of a piece of paper. Something in his tone made Snake stand up and walk over. The other bikers followed, forming a circle around Harold's booth. The regular customers watched nervously, expecting trouble, while Sarah held her phone ready to call for help if needed. But Harold wasn't worried. He sat straight in his seat, one hand resting on his cane, the other next to the photograph. For the first time in weeks, his hands weren't trembling at all. He looked up at the circle of leather-clad men surrounding him, meeting each of their eyes in turn. You boys think you know everything about motorcycles and brotherhood, he said quietly. You think a few patches and a loud engine make you tough, but there's something you should know about me, something that might change your minds about who you're dealing with. He placed one finger on the edge of the photograph, ready to reveal its contents. The tension in the diner was thick enough to cut with a knife. Even Snake seemed unsure now, thrown off by the sudden confidence in the old man's demeanor. Harold's lips curved into a slight smile, not one of fear or submission, but one that held secrets and stories these young bullies couldn't imagine. The revelation he was about to make would change everything, but first, he wanted them to understand exactly who they had been tormenting these past weeks. The whole diner held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. The morning sun streamed through Pete's diner's windows, casting long shadows across the tense scene. Harold sat surrounded by the bikers, his photograph still face down on the table. Snake crossed his arms, trying to maintain his intimidating presence, but something about the old veteran's calm demeanor had started to make him uncomfortable. You see this cap? Harold touched his Korean War veteran's hat gently. Each of these pins tells a story. Stories about brotherhood, courage, and sacrifice. Things you boys pretend to understand. His voice carried no anger, only a quiet certainty that commanded attention. The young biker who had broken Harold's cup shifted uneasily. What's that supposed to mean, old man? Before Harold could answer, Snake reached for the veteran's cap. Let's see if these pins are even real, he sneered, attempting to grab it off Harold's head. What happened next stunned everyone in the diner. Despite his age, Harold's hand shot up with surprising speed, catching Snake's wrist in a grip that made the biker leader's eyes widen. The movement was smooth, practiced, the muscle memory of a man who had once been trained for combat. Son, Harold said quietly, still holding Snake's wrist, that would be your second mistake today. Your first was assuming I was just another old man you could push around. The other bikers stepped forward threateningly, but Snake held up his free hand, stopping them. Something in Harold's grip and the steadiness of his gaze had caught his attention. The old man wasn't afraid, he never had been. Harold released Snake's wrist and picked up the photograph from the table. Since you're all so interested in authenticity, he said, maybe it's time you saw this. He turned the photograph over and placed it carefully on the table. The image showed a young Marine standing proudly next to a magnificent military motorcycle. The young man wore a uniform covered in medals, his posture straight and proud, his hands resting on the handlebars of a heavily modified Harley-Davidson Doliole, the same model used by military police and escort units during the Korean War. "That's me, 1952, Harold said simply. "I was part of the Marine Corps motorcycle regiment. We didn't ride for show or to intimidate people. We rode because lives depended on us delivering messages and supplies through enemy territory." Snake leaned closer to the photograph, his expression changing as he noticed details that only a true motorcycle enthusiast would recognize. The bike in the picture had custom modifications that were years ahead of their time. "Those customizations," Snake muttered, his voice losing its aggressive edge. "I've only seen work like that in old magazines." Harold nodded. "I didn't just ride bikes, I modified them. Made them faster, stronger, better suited for combat conditions. After the war, I opened a custom shop. Spent 40 years building and modifying motorcycles for veterans and civilians alike." The young biker who had broken the cup stepped back, his face pale. "Wait. Matthews Custom Cycles? You're that Matthews?" A murmur ran through the group of bikers. Even Sarah and Pete Jr., who had known Harold for years, looked surprised. The name Matthews Custom Cycles was legendary among serious motorcycle enthusiasts. "The very same," Harold replied, "though I suspect none of you bothered to ask my name before deciding I was an easy target." He pulled out another photograph, this one showing a younger version of himself standing in front of a garage filled with custom motorcycles. The sign above read, "Matthews Custom Cycles, veteran-owned and operated." Snake's tough guy facade crumbled completely. "My old man, he used to talk about a shop that did the best custom work in 3 states. Said the owner was a Korean War vet who could make a bike sing like no one else." Harold's eyes softened slightly. "Bob Snake Sr.? He was one of my best customers. I modified his 65 panhead. Added those custom exhaust pipes he was so proud of." Snake's face showed shock and then deep shame. "That bike, that was my dad's pride and joy. I still have it in my garage." The tension in the diner suddenly shifted. The other bikers stepped back, looking at Harold with new eyes. They weren't seeing a fragile old man anymore. They were seeing a living legend, someone who had helped shape the very culture they claimed to represent. But Harold wasn't finished. He had one more revelation that would completely transform these bikers' understanding of who they had been bullying all these weeks. Harold reached into his leather bag one more time and pulled out a worn leather photo album. The bikers watched in silence as his weathered hands carefully opened it to a specific page. Inside was something that made even Snake take a step back, a patch, faded with age but still clearly visible, showing the Marine Corps emblem surrounded by motorcycle wings. "This," Harold said, his voice filled with pride, "was the original patch of the 1st Marine Motorcycle Club. We founded it in 1948, right after I got back from my first tour." He looked up at the bikers surrounding him. "You boys wear your patches like you invented motorcycle clubs. But we were the ones who started it all." Snake pulled up a chair, sitting down heavily. His face showed a mix of awe and embarrassment as he looked at the patch. "The 1st Marine Motorcycle Club. That's not just a legend. You were really there." Harold nodded, turning more pages in the album. Each photograph told a story, young Marines on motorcycles, racing through dangerous terrains, delivering crucial messages during wartime. One photo showed Harold leading a group of riders, his young face determined and focused. "We didn't ride for show," Harold explained, pointing to a particular image. "These bikes saved lives. We carried medical supplies, dispatches, sometimes even wounded soldiers. Every ride could be our last, but we did it because our brothers needed us." The young biker who had broken Harold's cup stepped forward hesitantly. "Sir, Mr. Matthews, I've read about the Marine motorcycle units. They say you guys could ride through anything, mud, snow, even under enemy fire." "We did what we had to do," Harold replied simply. Then he turned to a page that made Snake's eyes widen. It showed a younger Harold working on a motorcycle, his hands deep in the engine. "This was taken at my first shop, right after the war. Your father's bike wasn't the only one I modified. Snake, see that Harley in the corner?" Snake leaned closer, then let out a low whistle. That's the same model I'm riding now. Those custom pipes, the modified frame. I designed those modifications," Harold said. "Started selling them to civilian riders in '55. That's why your father's bike handled so well. It was built on techniques we developed during the war, modified for peaceful roads. The atmosphere in the diner had completely transformed. The other customers watched in amazement as the once intimidating bikers gathered around Harold's table like students at the feet of a master. Even Sarah stood nearby, listening intently to every word. After the war, Harold continued, a lot of us veterans found peace on our bikes. We formed clubs, yes, but they were about brotherhood, helping each other heal. We never used our bikes to intimidate or bully. He looked pointedly at each biker in turn. We rode with honor. Snake removed his leather vest and laid it on the table. The patches that had seemed so impressive earlier now looked cheap compared to Harold's simple Marine Corps emblem. "Mr. Matthews," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I don't know how to apologize for how we've treated you." Harold studied the younger man's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "Your father was a good man, Snake. He understood what it meant to be part of the riding brotherhood. He never forgot where these traditions came from." The young biker who had broken the cup suddenly stepped forward, pulling out his wallet. "Please, sir, let me pay for the cup I broke. And maybe you could tell us more about the old days, about how you designed those custom bikes." Harold looked around at the group of bikers, seeing not the bullies they had been moments ago, but the riders they could become. These young men had lost their way, forgotten the true meaning of brotherhood that had started on those dangerous roads in Korea. "The cup can be replaced," Harold said finally. "But what matters now is what you boys plan to do with what you've learned today. The history of motorcycle clubs isn't about intimidation. It's about honor, service, and looking out for each other." Snake straightened up, a new respect evident in his bearing. He could sense that Harold had more to share, more wisdom to pass on. The question was, were they worthy of learning from this living legend they had so foolishly dismissed? The morning sun had risen higher now, and with it, the possibility of redemption hung in the air of Pete's Diner. The next morning at Pete's Diner was entirely different. Instead of roaring in with loud engines, Snake and his group parked their motorcycles quietly and respectfully. They entered the diner just as Harold was settling into his usual booth, each of them carrying something under their arms. "Mr. Matthews," Snake said, approaching the old veteran's table with newfound respect. "We spent all night going through our garages and old photographs. There's something we'd like to show you." Harold gestured for them to sit, and Sarah quickly brought extra chairs. His broken coffee cup had been replaced with a new one, but this morning, the bikers had brought something special, a carefully wrapped package that the young biker who had broken the original cup placed gently on the table. "We found this at an antique shop," the young man said nervously. "It's a Marine Corps coffee mug from the Korean War era. We know it can't replace your old one, but—" Harold unwrapped the package slowly, revealing a vintage military coffee mug. His hands trembled slightly, but this time with emotion rather than age. "This is the exact model we used during the war," he said softly. "Thank you, boys." Snake then spread out several old photographs on the table. "Sir, we think you might have worked on some of our father's and grandfather's bikes." He pointed to one photo showing a modified Harley from the 1960s. "This was my dad's first motorcycle. Look at those custom pipes." Harold put on his reading glasses and examined the photograph carefully. A smile spread across his face. "I remember this bike. Your father wanted something special for his return from Vietnam. I modified the exhaust system, adjusted the frame angle. He traced the lines of the motorcycle with his finger." Each bike had its own story. The other bikers gathered around, pulling out their own photographs and maintenance records. As Harold looked through them, he began pointing out modifications he had made, specifications he had designed. Some of these bikes were still running, passed down through generations. "You see this design here?" Harold pointed to a particular engine modification in one photo. "We developed this during the war when we needed more power for hill climbing in Korea. Later, I adapted it for civilian use. Many of these modifications are still being used today." The youngest biker leaned forward eagerly. "Sir, would you be willing to teach us about the proper way to modify and maintain our bikes?" Harold looked at the group of young men, seeing genuine interest in their eyes. "It's not just about the mechanics," he said thoughtfully. "It's about understanding why we ride, what it means to be part of this brotherhood." Snake nodded seriously. "We want to learn it all, Mr. Matthews. The history, the traditions, Everything you can teach us. Pete Jr. emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron. You boys could use my father's old garage behind the diner for your lessons, he offered. It's been empty since Dad retired, but it's still got all the tools. Harold's eyes lit up at the suggestion. It had been years since he had worked on a motorcycle, but his hands still remembered every detail, every specification. Well, he said, if you boys are serious about learning, I suppose I could share a few tricks of the trade. Sarah watched from behind the counter, smiling as she saw the transformation taking place. The same bikers who had been bullies just yesterday were now sitting respectfully around Harold's table, listening intently as he explained the finer points of motorcycle mechanics and maintenance. First lesson, Harold said, pulling out a pencil and starting to sketch on a napkin, is understanding that every modification has a purpose. We never change things just for show. During the war, each adjustment could mean the difference between life and death. The bikers crowded closer, watching as Harold's skilled hands drew detailed diagrams. Even after all these years, his knowledge was precise and thorough. He explained how each part worked together, how small changes could affect the entire machine. As the morning wore on, Pete's Diner became more than just a restaurant. It transformed into a classroom where wisdom was being passed from one generation to another. The regular customers watched in amazement as the once rowdy bikers took notes and asked thoughtful questions. Harold felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the coffee. He was teaching again, sharing the knowledge he had gained through years of service and experience. And somehow, he knew Martha would have been proud of how things had turned out. Over the next few weeks, Pete's Diner and the old garage behind it became a gathering place unlike any other. Harold would arrive early each morning for his usual breakfast, but now he had company. Snake and his group would be waiting, their motorcycles neatly lined up outside, ready for another day of learning. The transformation in the bikers was remarkable. Gone were the loud voices and intimidating manner. Instead, they showed up in clean work clothes, carrying notebooks and tools. Harold had awakened something in them, a desire to understand the true spirit of motorcycle culture and its deep connection to military service. One sunny morning, as Harold supervised Snake working on a carburetor adjustment, an unexpected visitor arrived at the garage. It was Bob Snake Sr., Snake's father, who had heard about the legendary Harold Matthews teaching his son. The older man walked with a slight limp, a reminder of his Vietnam service. Matthews, Bob Sr. said, his voice thick with emotion. I can't believe it's really you. That bike you modified for me back in '65, it helped me readjust to civilian life after Vietnam. Saved my life in more ways than one. Harold stood up straight, recognition lighting up his face. Bob Snake, you haven't changed a bit. The two men shook hands warmly while Snake watched, seeing his father in a new light. Dad, why didn't you ever tell me Mr. Matthews built your bike? Snake asked, wiping grease from his hands. Bob Sr. ran his hand along a nearby motorcycle. Some stories are hard to tell, son. That bike, it wasn't just about the modifications. Matthews here understood what we veterans needed, the peace we found on the open road. The other bikers gathered around as Bob Sr. began sharing stories about the old days, about how Harold's shop had become a sanctuary for returning veterans. Harold listened, nodding occasionally, remembering each bike and each rider who had come to him seeking more than just mechanical help. Sarah appeared from the diner carrying a tray of coffee for everyone. The garage had become an extension of Pete's Diner, and she enjoyed listening to the stories while serving refreshments. Even Pete Jr. would often step out of the kitchen to hear Harold's lessons. You boys, Bob Sr. addressed the group. You're learning from the best. Matthews didn't just build bikes, he built brotherhood. Every motorcycle that left his shop carried a piece of that spirit. The young biker who had once broken Harold's cup spoke up. Sir, we've been thinking, we want to honor that tradition. He looked at his fellow riders, who nodded encouragingly. We'd like to rename our club. Call it Matthews Legacy Riders, if that's okay with you, Mr. Matthews. Harold stood silent for a moment, touched by the gesture. He looked at these young men who had changed so much in such a short time. Where there had once been arrogance, he now saw respect. Where there had been ignorance, he saw a desire to learn and understand. A club is more than just a name, Harold said finally. It's about actions, about how you treat others, about the legacy you create. He paused, looking each rider in the eye. If you're serious about this, about carrying on the true traditions of motorcycle brotherhood, then I'd be honored. Snake stepped forward. We are serious, sir. We want to do it right this time. No more bullying, no more intimidation. We want to be the kind of riders that help others, that honor the history you've taught us. Bob Sr. placed a hand on his son's shoulder, pride evident in his expression. Looks like my boy finally found the right path, thanks to you, Matthews. The atmosphere in the garage was charged with emotion. These weren't just lessons about motorcycles anymore. They were lessons about life, about respect, about finding purpose. The old garage had become a place of transformation, where past and present merged, where mistakes were forgiven, and new traditions were born. Harold looked around at the faces of his students, seeing in them the same passion and dedication he had seen in his fellow Marines so many years ago. The brotherhood he had helped build during the war was finding new life in these young riders. As the afternoon sun filtered through the garage windows, casting long shadows across the tools and motorcycles, Harold knew that his legacy would live on through these reformed bikers. They had started as his tormentors but had become his students, and now they were becoming something even more. They were becoming his legacy. 1 year later, Pete's Diner looked very different on this special Sunday morning. Dozens of motorcycles lined the parking lot, their chrome sparkling in the summer sun. A new sign hung proudly next to the diner's entrance. Home of the Matthews Legacy Riders, all veterans welcome. Inside, Harold sat in his usual booth, but he wasn't alone. The diner was packed with bikers, veterans, and regular customers, all gathered for a special celebration. Snake stood at the front of the diner, tapping a spoon against his coffee cup to get everyone's attention. A year ago, Snake began, his voice carrying across the crowded room. We were lost. We thought being tough meant being cruel. We didn't understand what brotherhood really meant. He looked at Harold with respect, but thanks to Mr. Matthews, we learned what it truly means to be riders. The walls of Pete's Diner now displayed new photographs alongside the old ones. Pictures of Harold teaching in the garage, Snake, and his group helping stranded motorists. The newly formed Matthews Legacy Riders escorting veteran funeral processions with dignity and honor. The transformation was complete. Sarah moved through the crowd carrying Harold's special coffee mug, the Korean War vintage one the bikers had given him. But today, it wasn't just coffee she served. Pete Jr. emerged from the kitchen carrying a large cake decorated with motorcycle designs and the Marine Corps emblem. Mr. Matthews, the young biker who had once broken his cup, announced, "We have something to show you." He gestured toward the garage, and the crowd began moving outside. Harold walked slowly, supported by his cane and flanked by Snake and Bob Sr. As they approached the garage, he stopped in surprise. There, gleaming in the sunlight, stood his old military motorcycle, completely restored. "We found it in an old storage unit," Snake explained. "Took us months to track it down and restore it. Every modification, every detail, we did it exactly the way you taught us." Harold moved closer, his hand trembling as he touched the familiar handlebars. The motorcycle looked exactly as it had in that old photograph from Korea, down to the smallest detail. The young riders had poured their hearts into this restoration, applying everything they had learned over the past year. "That's not all," Bob Sr. said, pulling out an envelope. "The Matthews Legacy Riders have been busy. We've started a scholarship fund for veterans who want to learn motorcycle mechanics. It'll be called the Harold Matthews Veterans Trade School." Harold looked at the gathered crowd, the bikers who had become his students, the veterans who had found a new community, the regular diner customers who had witnessed this remarkable transformation. His eyes were moist, but his voice was steady. "When I came back from Korea," he said, "I found peace working on motorcycles. It helped me heal." He looked at the restored bike, then at his students. "Now you boys understand. It's not about the machines. It's about the people they bring together." Sarah stepped forward with another surprise. She unveiled a new permanent display case in the diner's entrance. Inside was Harold's original Marine Corps patch, his photographs from Korea, and the first Matthews Legacy Riders patch. A design that incorporated elements of the Marine Corps motorcycle unit with new symbols of service and brotherhood. "Every new member will learn your story, Mr. Matthews," Snake said. "They'll understand where our traditions come from, what it means to ride with honor." The celebration continued throughout the day. Veteran riders from across the state came to pay their respects, sharing stories and finding fellowship. The once rowdy bikers now served as respectful hosts, embodying the principles Harold had taught them. As the sun began to set, Harold sat on his restored motorcycle, not to ride it, but just to feel the familiar connection. He looked up at the diner where his daily routine had turned into something so much more meaningful, where a group of misguided young men had found direction, purpose, and true brotherhood. Pete's Diner was no longer just a place for breakfast. It had become a sanctuary for riders and veterans alike, a place where the past and present came together, where wisdom was passed down, and where the true spirit of motorcycle brotherhood lived on. And Harold Matthews, the 93-year-old veteran who had faced down bullies with quiet strength, had found a new purpose in his final years, not just as a teacher of motorcycle mechanics, but as a guardian of traditions, a builder of bridges between generations, and a reminder that it's never too late to make a difference in the lives of others. The legend of Harold Matthews would live on, not just in the restored motorcycle or the scholarship fund, but in the changed hearts and actions of every rider who learned what it truly meant to be part of this special brotherhood.